So in the early 2020s, inflation is really getting back to the levels of the early 1980s when we first started doing real estate projects in my career. Inflation is more dollars chasing fewer goods, basically, for all practical purposes. It's what we use as a definition. So the government has printed lots of money in the last few years, in the last 2 decades, and that money is now chasing more goods, which causes inflation, which causes people to be able to buy and pay higher prices for items that they would have never paid that price for before. One of the most recent transactions for an Andy Warhol painting was a $45 million sale. Well, nobody's ever paid $45 million for an Andy Warhol painting before. But now they have the capital to do that, so they're doing that. So that's an example of inflation. Another primary example of inflation is in 1913, when they started measuring inflation, you could have bought a candy bar for a nickel. Well, today you can't buy that same candy bar for $1.50, $1.75. That's inflation. So what is happening with inflation right now? As the government continues to print money, which they have for the past 100 years, they measure inflation using a basket of core statistics. The Department of Labor measures inflation, and they measure inflation, core inflation, by having a constant basket of goods and services that they measure the price of. And as those prices go up, that is their measure of inflation. Well, there's a big problem with this measurement, and one of the major problems is that a few years ago they took out two of the most inflating factors, food and energy. People have to have food and people have to have energy, and that when they took those out of the calculation, that skewed the calculation so far down that it really has very little meaning in today's world. But the government has tied all of their payments, Social Security, WIC program, food stamps, everything has been tied to the rate of inflation that they calculate. So if they really calculated the true rate of inflation, their interest payments would be enormous. So the government's highly motivated to keep the rate of inflation that they calculate down. So what they've done is they've taken out food and energy, two of the primary inflation factors, and that keeps the rate of inflation that they use to calculate their interest rates, that keeps it down. Well, that doesn't help the person. That doesn't help the individual, because the individual's out here paying anywhere from a 9 to 12% inflation rate, and the government's telling them that it's 2% inflation rate, but it's really 9% inflation rate, and they're losing purchasing power every day. So that's how inflation hurts an individual. So I had a friend earlier today ask me about, am I doing the right thing with my money? And the discussion we had is, okay, her financial advisor is using his tools that his company has given him to help her battle inflation and help her make money. Well, she was discussing with me that her IRA is smaller today than it was 2 years ago. Well, she hasn't kept pace with inflation. She hasn't made any money over the last few years, and in fact, she's actually worried about her retirement now. So that's an issue that people have to face. So what happens is, if you buy Coca-Cola stock, and it's a dividend-paying stock, and they pay an example of 3% dividends, well, you feel that that money's safe in Coca-Cola. It's a relatively well-known company, a large company, and we feel that the money's safe there. But what's happening is inflation is well above the 3% rate that the dividends are paying. So basically every month she's losing ground. She's losing buying power. She's losing what they call purchasing power in her portfolio. And in a few years, or even in a few months, she's not going to be able to buy near the products that she was able to buy with her retirement before. She's not going to be able to buy that $100,000 home that she wanted, because that $100,000 home has grown to where now it's a $175,000 home, and she's not going to be able to buy that. So that's an example of how she would lose her buying power. That happens in the bond market. So as companies borrow money, they borrow money at the prime rate plus 2. So they're borrowing money at 2%, 3%, 4% money. And inflation's, again, at 10%. Well, the people who actually loan them the money are making the 2, 3, and 4% interest, but inflation's at 10%. So the bondholders are actually losing buying power too. It's a very relatively poor investment for their capital. So what they need to find is something that will create a higher yield for them, more money in their pocket, and that's what custom private equity does. We design programs that are going to cash flow into the pockets of our partners every month and battle inflation, defeat inflation, and grow their wealth.